we decided to make it the only empire in our galaxy. Once I was old enough,
How is it possible for a race of superpowered aliens with the capacity to conquer or annihilate worlds to have just 50 living members? One single Viltrumite could bring an entire planet to its knees, and yet there are just so few Viltrumites remaining. Sounds wacky, right? Especially when you consider facts like they share similarities with the most powerful of the superheroes from comic books. I mean, they invoke in our minds an ultra-righteous DC superhero who has a certain weakness in the form of a green rock. Of course, the Viltrumites are far from righteous, but they are uber powerful. And if their near extinction has come about, there's just one single reason behind it all. It could only be because of themselves. The question that we've gathered here today to discuss is why. Now, the Viltrumite doom came in 3 major stages, and I will discuss each in as much detail as possible. But before I begin, please consider hitting those like and subscribe buttons. Those 2 puny smashes from you will help us to continue bringing you these marvelous videos. And now, let's begin. So as I was saying, the Viltrumite doom that left just 50 pure-blooded ones came in 3 stages. Let's discuss them.
once I was old enough, I joined the war effort. It was hard, but I believe in our
Emperor Argal's rise and fall, the first nail in the coffin. The Viltrumite Empire was once at the apex of all galactic empires of any value. In fact, Viltrum as a planet had achieved a perfect global society, and it was this very success of Viltrum that became the first nail in its coffin. Let me explain how. Rome wasn't built in a day, and likewise, the advancement and evolution of that planet didn't come overnight. Viltrumites had always been a powerful race that valued strength above all else. The promotions you received were based on strength. Your place and value in the society was based on what you could bring to the table and how many foes you could defeat. If a Viltrumite son or daughter died on the battlefield, the parents didn't mourn such a death, because a dead Viltrumite was never really a Viltrumite, and such Viltrumite scourge deserved death, is what the belief was. Initially, Viltrumites resembled humans in terms of strength and abilities, but that started to change over time. Call it an evolution if you will. Every next generation of Viltrumites started becoming more powerful than its previous generation, to the extent that they even got the ability to fly. Of course, this was caused by a certain special kind of atom called smart atoms, which constitute the Viltrumite DNA. Of course, as the race prospered, they improved the conditions of their planet in every imaginable way. However, much like humans, they didn't want to stop at that. Viltrumites wanted to expand, and gave themselves a notion and cause that I can best describe as the alien man's burden, on similar lines with the white man's burden. Anyway, that's when the Viltrum Empire started to expand beyond the planet of Viltrum. Of course, any empire is bound to have a royal family or a dynasty, and their last monarch, that is Emperor Argal, was born into the powerful Viltrumite dynasty. In fact, it's largely believed that the people belonging to the dynasty were stronger than the average Viltrumite because of just how pure-blooded the royal bloodline was. The lesser the dilution of the Viltrumite blood, the more invulnerable a Viltrumite was. Interestingly enough, Emperor Argal has been described in various capacities throughout the comic. Call it narrative fallacies or just a distorted idea of history held by the characters of the comic, it's your choice. However, it goes without saying that few thought Argal was benevolent, and his rule ushered a golden age for Viltrum before the Galactic War started, while others believed that it was he who sent armadas into the deep reaches of space so that he could control the worlds around him. Tyrant or not, Argal's rule was one of prosperity. The widely accepted belief is that he was the one who started the whole thing with the tyranny and bloodshed of other races that these superpowered individuals conquered. The Viltrumites followed his orders to the last word, no matter how cruel the order might be, irrespective of the enormous amounts of deaths that such an order would bring. However, there was one who decided this orgy of blood and bones had to stop. Of course, I'm talking about Thetis, the first Viltrumite who saw evil in the ways and methods of his people. He knew that the Viltrum Empire would go on conquering more and more worlds for another 1,000 years, and the only way to put an end to it was through culling the head giving the orders. That is, Emperor Argal. One day, Thetis went to Argal and stuck a bone into his skull, killing him and sending the entire Viltrumite Empire into a frenzy. This was pretty much the first major blow to the Empire. It was like a xenomorph hive losing its queen. No one knew what to do. You see, with Argal's death, the Viltrum Empire lost a highly able and wise ruler, someone who was a visionary and had the ability to bring the entire galaxy to heel. Naturally, losing Argal as their emperor, Viltrumites lost several future opportunities along with his tactical mind. Although Thetis flew the scene shortly after the assassination of his evil king, the second-in-command, Grand Regent Thrag, took over, and this became the second major blow to the Viltrum Empire.
population was cut in half, but what emerged from the ashes was unstoppable.
The Great Purge and its aftermath. After Argol's fall, the Viltrum population went into a state of chaos. A civil war broke out between the Viltrumites. Now, history tells us that most civil wars happen when one group of people goes against their brethren, who have a different set of beliefs. But in the case of this invincible race, the civil war took place to ensure that only the strongest of their people survived. It was a genocide that the stronger Viltrumite committed against their weaker brethren. In the end, nearly half the Viltrum population was killed, leaving the numbers to 3.5 billion compared to the 7 billion prior to the Viltrumite Civil War, also known as the Great Purge. Many of the known Viltrumites we know, such as Anissa and Thrag, survived the Purge. In fact, even Nolan survived the Purge, but he may have been fairly young during this time. When the dust settled in the aftermath of this messy business, Thrag became the ruler. What emerged from the ashes of the old society was a fierce and unbeatable warrior race. Once the battle-scarred planet had been repaired, they set their sights on the far reaches of the galaxy. It was proposed that they bring their new world order to the other worlds. That's why I earlier mentioned the alien man's burden. I mean, there was literally no need for them to go out there and conquer races and civilizations and worlds, but they did. Anyway, the decision was agreed upon unanimously. The Viltrumite High Council, which existed since the days of Argol, approved the creation of the World Conquering Committee. It seems like there was no thought given to the nomenclature of the committee. Moving forward, the first step of this new initiative was to locate other planets that were in crucial stages of development. In other words, they were trying to find planets that were far enough along that adding them to the Empire would be a worthwhile endeavor, but not so far along that the Viltrumites would be unable to breach through the defenses of these planets. The second step was to install a global watchtower where the Viltrum Empire would keep supplies for long-term occupation and monitor the entire planet from orbit. Mind you, this expansion pretty much started during Argol's rule and saw its full potential under Thrag. Moving on, the final step was to send a team of representatives down to the planet's surface to announce their takeover. This team would stay behind on the planet, monitoring its activities. Races who cooperated were given access to Viltrumite technology, which would improve the quality of life under the Viltrum Empire's rule. Of course, races that resisted were not quite looked upon with favorable eyes. The expansion effort was a success, and the Viltrum people doubled their efforts to gain control of more and more planets. Eventually, the races that had been conquered were used to help in the expansion. However, all these expansions and atrocities didn't go unnoticed. Often, revolutions happen when people have nothing to lose. Take the French Revolution, for instance, or the downfall of the British colonial empire. The oppressed had nothing to lose apart from their rather miserable lives, so they chose to stand against their oppressors. And this same resentment was brewing across the galaxy against the Viltrum Empire. Naturally, various peoples were looking for options to defeat the Viltrumites. For instance, the Unopans had to resort to breeding camps to save their species from extinction, and it was because of one of the breeding camps that Alan the Alien, the strongest Unopan, was born. He later went on to join the Coalition of Planets, founded by Thaddeus on Telescria. Yep, the same Thaddeus who had assassinated Argol to protect the galaxy from Viltrumite terror. The Coalition of Planets had a singular objective: the defeat of the Viltrum Empire. Many races joined the Coalition, races that were scientifically and technologically advanced. And this brings me to the final leg in the journey of the near extinction of the Viltrumites. Scourge virus. Thaddeus used his own body to help in the creation of the Scourge virus, a virus that was fatal to the Viltrumites and spread like crazy between their ranks. Interestingly, although Thaddeus created and unleashed the virus on the Viltrumites, he failed to learn the exact toll it took on his people. More on that later. So, the Scourge virus was a biological weapon engineered by the enemies of the Viltrumite Empire. Conventional warfare had failed. Viltrumites were too powerful, so the Coalition resorted to developing a virus tailored to Viltrumite DNA. The first strain of the Scourge virus was introduced at the height of the Viltrumite Empire's power. The exact method of deployment isn't described in detail, but the Coalition managed to release the virus on Viltrum. Once unleashed, it spread rapidly and uncontrollably. All attempts by the Viltrumites to contain or quarantine the outbreak failed. Soon the entire planet was infected. This catastrophic plague swept through the Viltrumite population like wildfire, affecting virtually everyone. The virus was horrifyingly effective. It killed Viltrumites at an alarming rate, leading to mass casualties on a scale never before seen. It's said that so many Viltrumites died in orbit that their bodies formed a ring of corpses around the planet, a grisly echo of Viltrum's planetary rings. In total, 99.9% of the Viltrumite population perished, either from the infection itself or due to the subsequent loss of their powers. Fewer than 50 Viltrumites in the entire universe survived the first strain's rampage. Those few who did survive experienced severe symptoms. The virus temporarily sapped their famed Viltrumite strength and near invulnerability. Essentially, it stripped survivors of their powers while the illness ran its course, leaving them weak and invulnerable. Many additional Viltrumites died during this period of weakness. Some likely succumbed to injuries that their diminished powers could no longer withstand. Only the absolute hardiest or luckiest individuals managed to pull through and recover. The Viltrumite Empire was left on the brink of collapse. With less than 50 survivors out of an entire species, their dominion over the galaxy was suddenly in jeopardy. The core leadership of the Empire had been gutted. Even many of Emperor Argal's heirs were dead, except for one. The survivors, among them high-ranking people like Grand Regent Thrag and Nolan Grayson, Omni-Man, regrouped and struggled to maintain control. They realized they had to hide their weakness. If the rest of the galaxy learned that only a few dozen Viltrumites remained, the Empire's subject worlds would undoubtedly rebel and the Coalition would press its advantage. To prevent this, the Viltrumites circulated false information to keep up the facade of a vast, powerful empire. They spread rumors and propaganda, implying that their ranks were as large and formidable as ever. This deception kept many worlds in fear, buying the Viltrumites time to recover. With their population devastated, the Viltrumites also postponed further conquests and went into a survival mode. Expansion of the Empire effectively halted for a long period. They could no longer afford widespread wars or heavy losses. Instead, the few Viltrumites focused on consolidating what they still controlled and slowly rebuilding their numbers. Over the centuries following the plague, the Viltrumite Empire limped on, a shadow of its former self. It remained dangerous, even one Viltrumite is a formidable force, but the grand vision of endless conquest was put on hold. Culturally, this was a turning point. The proud Viltrumites were forced to confront their own vulnerability. An empire that once prized strength above all had nearly been destroyed by an invisible enemy. Later in the timeline, thousands of years after the initial outbreak, during the modern events of the Invincible comic, a second strain of the Scourge virus was developed. This new strain was created as a direct response to the remaining Viltrumites' resilience. By the end of the comic's Viltrumite war arc, the Viltrumite Empire had been dealt another blow. Their home planet was destroyed in battle, but dozens of Viltrumites still lived, mostly those same survivors of the first virus and their offspring. The coalition of planets, still determined to end the Viltrumite threat once and for all, decided to resurrect their deadliest weapon. The second strain of the Scourge virus was secretly engineered under the orders of Thetis, who by then was the coalition's elderly figurehead. Thetis himself was a survivor of the original virus, meaning his body contained antibodies to the first strain. He offered samples of his own cells to coalition scientists so they could modify the virus to overcome any immunity the Viltrumites had developed. In other words, this new strain was an improved version, designed to bypass the antibodies present in the surviving Viltrumite's blood. Any Viltrumite who had survived the first virus, and thus becoming immune to it, would still be vulnerable to the second strain. The second strain was just as lethal as the first, if not more so. It was tailor-made to finish the job that the original Scourge virus started. By this point, Alan the Alien had become the new leader of the coalition of planets, succeeding Thetis, killed during the Viltrumite War. Alan was a longtime ally of Invincible, but as the coalition's leader, he faced enormous pressure to protect the universe from Viltrumite resurgence. The Viltrumites who survived the war had relocated and integrated into life on Earth with an agreement or hope that they would live peacefully. However, the coalition discovered that the Viltrumites intended to rebuild their numbers by breeding with humans. Since Viltrumite DNA is dominant, any children they had with human partners would essentially be Viltrumite, creating a new generation of superpowered beings. In the coalition's eyes, this meant the Viltrumites could quietly raise an army of hybrids on Earth, eventually regaining enough strength to threaten the galaxy again. This prospect was unacceptable to Alan. Fueled by both the coalition's mission and his own people's history of suffering under Viltrumite cruelty, Alan decided to use the new Scourge virus as a final solution. His goal was nothing less than the genocide of the remaining Viltrumites, even if that meant massive collateral damage. The plan devised by Alan and the coalition scientists was to deploy the second strain on Earth, since Earth had become the sanctuary for the Viltrumite survivors. The idea was to release the virus into Earth's atmosphere, infecting any Viltrumite or Viltrumite hybrid in range. However, this plan carried an extreme risk, because humans are genetically similar enough to Viltrumites, close enough to produce viable offspring. The Scourge virus would also spread to Earth's human population, killing them as well. In essence, wiping out the Viltrumites on Earth meant wiping out humanity. Alan was fully aware of this. He was willing to sacrifice the entire human race to ensure the Viltrumites were eradicated. Alan himself struggled with this choice. As a friend of Mark and Nolan Grayson, he knew the value of human life. But as coalition leader, he felt duty-bound to put the universe's safety first. Thrag even remarks that he knows Alan doesn't truly want to go through with it. Nevertheless, the decision was made. The second strain would be used as a doomsday weapon on Earth if there were no other way to contain the Viltrumites. Alan traveled to Earth's orbit with a single canister of the new Scourge virus, accompanied by Oliver Grayson, Mark's half-brother, who's half Viltrumite himself. They intended this as a stealth mission to infect the Viltrumites before anyone could stop them. However, their approach was detected, and they were intercepted above Earth by Invincible, who had learned of their plan, and Thrag. Thrag confronted Alan, demanding to know why he shouldn't kill him on the spot. Alan responded by threatening to break the virus canister canister, essentially holding everyone hostage with the threat of immediate infection. As Thrag and Alan negotiated, with Thrag surprisingly attempting to reason and propose a truce, Mark desperately tried to defuse the situation. Before they could reach a peaceful solution, violence broke out. The arrival of the Guardians of the Globe escalated the chaos, and Oliver, believing in Alan's cause, grabbed the canister and dove toward Earth to release it manually. Mark couldn't let that happen. He chased his brother through the sky, tackling Oliver to stop him. A struggle followed in midair high above the planet. In the tussle, the Scourge virus canister was accidentally cracked open, and its contents discharged directly onto Mark. Mark was immediately exposed to the virus at point-blank range. Alan quickly called off any further action once the canister was spent. He confirmed to Mark that the release was contained. The virus wasn't spreading across Earth's atmosphere, because it relies on direct contact with a carrier to infect others. Mark, though horrified to have been doused, was relieved to learn the planet was safe from immediate outbreak. Alan and Thrag both realized the tragic irony that the one person who strove to prevent this catastrophe became the sole victim of the virus. Alan placed Mark into quarantine to protect others and to monitor Mark's condition. At this point, the second strain had effectively been used, not as intended, but it was out in the world, coursing through Mark Grayson's veins. Mark's infection with the Scourge virus had profound short-term and long-term consequences. In the immediate aftermath, Mark became extremely sick. The virus affected him just as it did full-blooded Viltrumites. He grew weak as his powers faded, and he was bedridden for an extended period. Mark essentially lost all his Viltrumite abilities while his body fought the infection. For a time, the hero Invincible was completely out of commission. He had never experienced illness like this before. The reason for Mark's survival is attributed to his heritage. Nolan's royal bloodline gave Mark a stronger constitution or healing factor that eventually overcame the disease. It's later revealed that Nolan Grayson is the son of Argal, the former Viltrumite emperor, meaning that Mark is Argal's grandson and has the so-called superior Viltrumite lineage. This lineage was implied to be especially resilient, which likely contributed to Mark fighting off the virus. Mark was in recovery for perhaps 6 months in the comics timeline. Eventually, his powers returned once his body eradicated the virus completely. While Mark was quarantined, tests were done and it was discovered that his Viltrumite DNA matched the genetic signature of Argal's royal line. In other words, the Coalition and the Viltrumites realized that Mark, and by extension his father Nolan, were direct descendants of the former Viltrumite emperor. Grand Regent Thrag, who had secretly known about Nolan's heritage, wanted to keep this buried because it threatened his claim to leadership. After Mark pulled through the virus, Thrag's worst fear came true. The truth got out. Thrag attempted to eliminate Nolan to secure his role, attacking him in a rage, but other Viltrumites overheard Thrag calling Nolan the rightful heir. The Viltrumite survivors turned against Thrag for his deceit. They declared that they had followed the old Emperor Argal for his wisdom, not just strength, and now saw Thrag as a usurper who hid their true heir. As a result, Thrag was deposed and later exiled. Nolan Grayson was installed as the new Viltrumite leader, restoring Argal's dynasty through Nolan's bloodline. This political shift within the Viltrumites, a direct outcome of Mark's infection revealing his royal blood, had huge ramifications. It meant the Viltrumites now had a leader who was formerly an enemy of the Empire, and who had a very different perspective on how to move forward. The Scourge virus fundamentally changed Viltrumite society. After the first strain, the Viltrumites were humbled by near extinction, which made them more cautious and covert. They maintained a conquering ethos outwardly, but in reality, they spent centuries quietly recuperating from their losses. This trauma likely instilled in them a sense of fragility that hadn't existed before. They now knew that a targeted weakness could destroy them, so they became more strategic and secretive. After the second strain incident and the Viltrumite War, the Viltrumites took an even more dramatic cultural turn. Under Nolan's leadership, they agreed to a truce with the Coalition of Planets. The terms essentially were, the Viltrumites would cease hostilities and live in hiding on Earth, and in return, the Coalition and Alan would not pursue their extermination. This was the end of the Viltrumites' age-old goal of outright conquest, at least for the foreseeable future. So yeah, that was the story of the Viltrumite Empire and its crazy history.